Hello, welcome to this new module. This is the module which is called Gender, Data and Indices. It's our third module in this gender responsive policy, economic policy management in the context of COVID-19 pandemic course. I hope you have already enjoyed the last two modules, which looked at different things. And we would like to continue by also looking at what this module focuses on. This module, as you can see, is a module that is going to be focusing on the concept of gender, data, and indices. And this module introduces you as participants to the use of data, statistics, and indicators and indices in gender-aware economics and economic policy making. It highlights the standard indices and indicators often and how they fail to reflect gender issues because of the fact that they widely use concepts like household aid as a unit of analysis, economic analysis. So this module also introduces participants to the most well-known international indices like the Africa gender-related indices like the Human Development Index, the African Gender and Development Index. We also delved in some detail in the African Gender and Development Index as one of the indices that measures gaps between the status of African women and men and assesses the progress made by African governments in implementing gender policy. So what is expected of you as participants in this course? One is to appreciate the role of data in policy making, but also to understand how gender disaggregated data is used in the implementation of gender responsive public policy. So very quickly to start off, what is data? Well, data is a collection of observations that can be used to represent some specific attributes of something that is witnessed and of interest to the observer. So, but collecting data can be difficult, as you will see later in the next module, module 4, when we introduce the concept of unpaid care. You realize that work that takes place within the household and in the community sometimes falls outside the definition of production in the system of national accounts, and as a result is not counted in the GDP. And sometimes there is a general shortage of data on things like unpaid care work compared to other indicators that we have in economics, although unpaid care work takes place widely across the whole economy. Now, data on its own carries no meaning. Only when it is interpreted does it convey information. This suggests that, therefore, to understand data, we have to understand how do we attach meaning to data. Now, there are 4 distinct aspects that I would like to talk about, or dimensions that we talk about when we talk about data. First is that data must address a characteristic of interest. And that characteristic of interest is what we call a variable that could represent one of the attributes. For example, on unpaid care work, it would be something like the number of hours spent performing unpaid care work per day. That is a variable. Now, observations about the variable, in this case, if we say number of hours spent on unpaid care work per day, are collected, the observations are collected from the respondent. Therefore, the respondent becomes a unit of analysis. It could be people, it could be household, it could be social groups, depending on how your research has been structured. And that is what then gives you the knowledge regarding the variable. Now, the observer is always interested in the response from the unit of analysis to understand what is represented by the variable. And that response is what we call a value. That is what the respondent is. That's what you get from the respondent in relation to the characteristic of interest. Now, data can only be interpreted within what we call a wider evaluation that purports to logically explain what is observed. And that's what we call a theory. So when we talk about theory or conceptual framework, we are really saying that if I am going to explain this data, it can only be explained through this logic, which I am proposing. For example, the value of the number of hours a respondent woman spends per day performing unpaid care work can only be interpreted when unpaid care work as a concept is related to other concepts within an analytical framework. That logically explains simply the economic characteristics of gender relations. So if you want to understand, for example, unpaid care work, you can only understand it within the concept of understanding what is work, what is counted when you talk about work, and how does that relate to the economy. And based on that, then you can say, this is what it means for us. So what are the types of data? There are two forms, there are two forms. The first one is the quantitative data. And in quantitative data, we are really talking about data that is in a numerical form, commonly drawn from a large number of cases of units of analysis to compare and analyze the widest possible range of values across a case. In this way, the structure of data can be inferred and homogeneous generalizations produced that answer some of the descriptive questions that one may have. But we also have something called qualitative data. And when we talk about qualitative data, we are usually talking about non-numerical forms of data that consist of words, text, photographs, videos, sound recordings, anything like that. So qualitative data is commonly drawn from a smaller number of cases, emphasizing the complexity, sometimes what we call the depth, the heterogeneity of the data to produce answers to explain the analytical questions. Now, a data set, what is a data set? A data set consists of a number of units of analysis. So a variable, a number of variables, and a set of values that links the units of analysis to the variables. So if the focus, for example, is on unpaid care work in the household, this might also be linked to the productive work outside the household. Now, if a large number of households produced values of the time devoted to unpaid care work and productive employment, the result would be a data set. That is the values being brought together. So when patterns of consistent observations within data are identified within theoretically informed analytical frameworks, it becomes possible to answer both the descriptive questions, who, what, where, but also the explanatory analytical questions, like why and how. Now, the information generated by the answers to the questions explains knowledge, and in so doing contributes to building a theory. Now, let's talk a little bit about statistics. Now, statistics is really, in a very summarized form, the quantitative data and qualitative data expressed numerically, often to compress evidence into a form that summarizes the evidence so that the inferences can be drawn from that evidence. Now, this tool of analysis is what we know as statistics. For example, when we say an average compresses the range of values attached to a variable, it produces a summary statistic. Now, the value of the number of hours, for example, spent performing unpaid care work per day by all people, for example, if you do a survey, and by all the responding women in one survey, could be summarized as an average number of hours spent by women performing unpaid care work. So this is the case for both quantitative and qualitative data expressed numerically, such as the average number of people that believe that women are capable to successfully handle leadership and those kinds of things. We could have different ways of doing this. So to actually produce statistics, you can produce statistics from either quantitative or qualitative data. Let's talk a little bit about analysis. Now, data analysis, which is the quantitative evidence and the qualitative evidence presented numerically, is analyzed to understand how these variables vary, or what are the variations between the different variables when data is collected. So when examining the distribution of a variable, attention is usually paid on three major properties for any variable. One is the tendency of data to cluster around a certain central point in its pattern of variation. And that's what we call the central tendency. Do we see that, for example, women between a certain age group are associated to doing certain types of work, or men within a certain age group do not do certain types of work? So that you can observe through the variables in the data. The other is what we call the extent to which it is spread across its domain. And this is a measure of data dispersion. How spread is it? Is it all over the population that you are observing in the analysis, or is it for a small number? But also the shape of the data across the domain. Data may be symmetrical, it may be skewed, and the fundamental objective of the data analysis of quantitative and qualitative information is usually to explain, use the central tendency, the spread, the shape across the domain of a variable, so that it can explain something that is of interest to the observer or the researcher in this case. Quickly on indicators. When we talk about indicators, we're really talking about indicators are evidence constructed from a number of data series or statistics that represent data. They are assembled to monitor selected areas of socio-economic life that are deemed to be of importance. For example, we sometimes have employment indicators that are assembled from data sets in which the various values of a number of variables related to the different forms of productive work as defined by the national accounts, the system of national accounts, are linked to the unit of analysis, which are usually the individuals. We also have something called composite indices. Now, composite indices are numbers derived from a combination of various indicators on the basis of an underlying model of a multidimensional concept that is measured. An important index that we discuss here is what we call the Human Development Index. And typically, indices make fairly arbitrary decisions about which indicators are deemed to be important. As a result, while indices may be useful for purposes of advocacy, their utility for policy making is far more limited. So where do data come from? A number of sources. First, we have what we call the primary data, and that is where the values are obtained directly from the unit of analysis. And this can be done in two ways. One is by direct observation of the value of the variable associated to the unit of analysis, like physical measurement. Somebody, for example, if you're doing a study on height, you can go and measure people as height specifically. And sometimes this is what we say is the most reliable, but also most expensive technique. But there could also be indirect observation of the value of the variables associated with the unit of analysis. And usually this is derived using structured or semi-structured interviews, in this case, called surveys. And this is the most widely used data acquisition technique in social sciences. Now, there are also other ways of obtaining data. Second one is secondary data. Secondary data, usually you can get this from published sources like statistical books, published statistics of national, international sources or research institutions which are published regularly, and you can derive them. And usually these have done their own primary data collection. But then there is also what we call tertiary data, which are primary and secondary evidence that is gathered by another researcher published in a book or in an article. So that can also be another source of data. But there are also things like time use surveys in the economic analysis, for example, of unpaid care work. Time use surveys have been an important source of primary evidence that generates data on how people spend their time during the day. So these are different types of data that are sometimes used and how we get data. Tertiary, secondary, as well as primary are the major ones. But I just wanted to touch on time use so that you know that that is a major one that can be of interest, especially for labor force surveys and for those who are interested in understanding measurements on unpaid care work. What are some of the issues in data collection? One is quantity. The availability of data for gender-aware economic analysis and policy making is highly variable by country. However, as a general rule, there are more secondary data available than is generally recognized. But also another issue is the issue of sources of error in data. We know that not all data that you sort of associate with when doing research will have the same reliability. Sometimes data, the response errors in the data is something to watch out for by the respondent. Sometimes the respondent may not understand the question, may answer a question, in a way that doesn't give you what it should. Recording and transcription errors. Sometimes the researchers themselves make mistakes by making, recording things that are different from what else was observed. But also processing errors, where when you go to the data entry itself, when you are moving the data from the questionnaire, from the research notes into an analytical framework, you can also have some errors there. So let's talk about sex disaggregated data versus gender statistics. When we talk about sex disaggregated data, these are variables collected from both women and men as units of analysis. And sex disaggregated data does not adequately reflect the state of gender relations in a given society, as it does not consider the different socio-economic realities of women and men. While yes, it does collect data of different sexes, but in terms of actually giving you an adequate reflection, it's not sufficient. This means that the concepts and methods used in data collection need to be adequately formulated to measure the existing gender constants and differentials that are reflected in society. Additionally, social and cultural factors must be considered if we are going to look at this data. As a result, gender-based biases in data collection, analysis, and presentation can emerge very easily, even when you have sex desegregated data. If this is done, gender can be mainstreamed in data collection and analysis by ensuring that you produce what we call gender statistics. And such, the detail of some of this can be found in the full module narrative that is posted for you to look at in this course. Let me very quickly now talk about some types of data that is collected internationally, but also at a national level. The Human Development Index is one of those that are critical that I would invite you to read about. There's a lot of literature on the Human Development Index, especially on the UNDP websites. And the Human Development Index is really anchored in the work of one renowned scholar called Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen's capability approach of poverty and human development is used here. If you want, there is a book. You can ask me and I can share that book with you in case you are interested. And the HDI focuses on 3 basic dimensions that are seen as prerequisites for the enlargement of human choices. Focuses on health, education, and knowledge, and a decent standard of living. And the HDI is an index like other indices. It is constructed from indicators. Thus, the 3 dimensions are respectively measured by the following 4 indicators. One of the indicators that is used in the HDI is life expectancy at birth. And then it also uses literacy rate, which comprises 2/3 of HDI's knowledge dimension. And then it also uses the combined gross enrollment ratio for primary, secondary, and tertiary, which comprises 1/3 of the HDI's knowledge dimension. And then it uses GDP per capita expressed by what we call the purchasing power parity in US dollars. Now, these are things you can read a little bit more in detail, but this is really to quickly highlight what they are. Now, the dimensions are then standardized to values between 0 and 1, and a simple average is taken to arrive at an overall Human Development Index, which has a value in the average of 0 to 1. Now, league tables are published on the annual Human Development Reports of UNDP, and they are widely quoted. So there are several methodological notes that are also issued by the UNDP, which I would love, and there is a dedicated website on the Human Development Index that you can look at. Some of the limits, of course, is that indices are appealing because there is only one number, but having one single number is sometimes very hard to use in policymaking. UNDP uses the international data sets collected by national statistics organizations and cleaned in the interests of uniformity. So again, when you're cleaning data, there are different judgments that have to be taken, which is also a challenge. The results in the use of relatively old data and thus out-of-date indicators is also an issue. And there is also a need to have indicators for as many countries as possible, so that you can, as possible, and this can lead to the use of the lowest common denominator variables rather than variables that would best reflect what the index aims to do. And that has also gender implications. And also, data is always not available. As you all know, data in different countries, there are several challenges. Sometimes countries collect, sometimes they don't, and all that. And the indicators used to construct the HDI are all based on averages, and thus they do not capture some of the inequalities. The other index I would love to talk about is the Gender Development Index, and this uses the same variables as HDI, but each of the components is adjusted for gender equality using what we call the equality aversion parameter. Now, the GDI shares the problems of the HDI as well, and also has some further problems. The number that UNDP uses for the GDI as the parameter for the aversion of to inequality is 2. The penalty of gender gaps, which is entirely subjective. There is an assumption that the ratio of female to male wages in the non-agricultural sector is the same as in the agricultural sector. And the ratio of 0.75 or 75% is assumed for all countries for which there are no data on the ratio of female to male wages. There is also the gender empowerment measure, and the GEM, as in short, focuses on political participation and decision making and on power. The components are measured by women's representation in parliaments and women's share of positions classified as legislators, senior officials, managers, women's share of jobs such as professional and technical workers, and women and men's estimated earned income. And not all countries have data on all these elements, and therefore the GEM is calculated for fewer countries compared to other indices. The GEM also measures income more or less in the same way as the GDI. We also have the African Gender and Development Index. This is one that was started in the early 2000s by UNECA. It's been around for some time, and it was developed, and it developed what we call the African Gender and Development Index and the African Women's Progress Scorecard or Scoreboard. Now, the AWPS, or the Africa Women's Progress Scoreboard, is based on more qualitative judgments, although it is given numerical scores. The LGDI is also similar to the GDI and the GEM, to the Gender and Development Index, as well as the Gender Empowerment Index. In that they are computed from quantitative data, with major differences being that they are far more indicators, about 43 in all that are looked at. And the indicators are derived from 3 blocks meant to reflect the social, the economic, as well as the political power. And the indicators all deal with gender issues that relate to the relations between women and men. And this means that maternal mortality and violence against women are not covered in that case. And all indicators are weighted equally. And you can read more in terms of detail on this. The MDGs, you know, these started with the turn of the millennium in 2000. 189 United Nations member states adopted them when they adopted the Millennium Declaration. And within that, we had the MDG 3 that was about gender equality and empowerment. And there was even a target on eliminating gender disparity in primary and secondary education, preferably by 2005, and in all levels no later than 2015. And it was assigned as a measure for the achievement of MDG 3. As you all know, we didn't get there, but there were also other, like the ratio of boys and girls in primary, secondary, and tertiary. There was also another one on the ratio of literate females and males, and the share of women in wage employment in non-agricultural sector, the proportion of seats of women in national parliaments. So the MDGs, as you know, ended, and now we have the SDGs, but you can go and read a little bit about what the MDGs were saying and what were the critical lessons from that, from the UN websites. The Sustainable Development Goals is what we are implementing now. These were formally endorsed by the United Nations Summit of the 2015 in September. It was actually chaired by the president of Uganda, following a two-year process where there was quite a bit of consultations globally and intergovernmental negotiations. Now, the SDG framework brings together all the three aspects of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, into one, and they are all in a much more integrated way than what was done under the SDGs. The framework now has 17 goals, 169 targets, and it applies to all countries across the world with a deadline to be met in 2030. Now, the SDG 5 is one of point of interest that I would love to invite you to look at. It focuses on achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls, and it speaks specifically to government's commitments to end discrimination and gender-based violence, eliminate child marriage and female genital mutilation, ensure access to sexual and reproductive health, protect women and girls' reproductive rights, eliminate gender disparities, and it goes on to also looking at issues of reducing the burdens of unpaid care work on women and girls. Goal 5 on achieving gender equality has a number of targets. I would love to invite you to look at them. While I have a slide here, I'm not going to read all of them, but I could invite you to look at target 5.4, which is an interesting, important target for us in this course, because it's the target that focuses on recognizing and valuing unpaid care work and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household, the family, as nationally appropriate. Now, these are important statements, global statements and commitments that have been made. The recommendation of the SDG indicator framework in terms of gender, one is that gender differentiated statistics and indicators must be collected in order to measure gender gaps, that at a minimum, data must be disaggregated on the basis of age, sex, geography, income, disability, race, and ethnicity. And even though some indicators are measured by households, the data collected for those indicators should be disaggregated, and the number of indicators should not be arbitrarily limited. And that indicators must comply with the promote current human rights standards, and they must be scoped to elaborate the indicator in the coming years in order to ensure that we adapt to the changing development environments. For example, right now, as we are faced with COVID, one of the things we need to do is to go back to those indicators and see what does it mean for us as we focus and we have to deal with the question of the pandemics. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me. As I said, this was a course that focuses on gender and development, and we would like you to look at this a little bit more. We have talked about indicators and indices and in a very broad way. There is a full module that you can look at and look at the specifics, and that will also give you a lot more in terms of insights on how we can use data in economic policy making and economic policy management. So thank you very much for listening to me. I will see you in the course itself, but for now, this is it from me. I thank you very much.